Crocodiles are a Swiss delicacy. But if you were to look for some of the most advanced crocodile locomotives, you'd have to go to Germany to find two locomotive classes standing right on the edge between past and future. But first, let's wind back a little bit. Just like the Bavarian neighbors, the railways in Württemberg had to fight with pretty steep inclines, with the most famous of them being the Geislinger Steige, for which in fact the mighty K-class was developed. But unlike their Bavarian neighbors, the state railways in Württemberg never engaged with electrification. It's not that there were never any plans to do that, but they all fell through. First of all, and probably most importantly, there wasn't enough electricity from hydroelectric plants which could support an electrified rail system. And in addition to that, electric locomotives weren't yet reliable enough. At least not when it comes to the high end of required power. Remember, we have to fight with inclines here. And when the war broke out in 1914, well, that was that. At least for now. As the nationalization of the German railways after the war brought with it many new possibilities. And their electrification plans were picked up again. And this time they looked a lot more promising. First of all, electric traction had improved a lot over the past years. And due to the nationalization was it now possible to use energy from Bavarian hydroelectric plants, which the Reichsbahn had shares in Württemberg, as the Reichsbahn's share of electricity from these power plants was way too much for the Bavarian network anyway. And on top of that, the Reichsbahn also managed to get a good number of outside funds and credits for that project. So the plans to electrify the Geislinger Steige finally took shape in 1931, and by 1933 the electrification was complete. However, there was one other major problem. Electric traction had improved a lot, but so far there was not really a locomotive that was suitable enough for this new route. There were two existing classes which would have been powerful enough. On one hand the E91, which, using connecting and coupling rods, was very much deemed outdated at that point, and on the other hand the way more modern E95 with individually driven axles. However, the later one, being a double locomotive, was deemed far too expensive. So ultimately a new class was needed, a single unit with 6 individually driven axles. Originally it was intended for this new class to have leading axles. However, due to the low speed of the locomotive, just 65 km per hour, 70 for the serial machines, the leading axles were deemed not that necessary after all, and with that, omitted, introducing a new generation of heavy electric freight locomotives, as it was the first one to combine individually driven axles and no leading axles whatsoever, which meant that the entirety of the locomotive weight would rest on the driven axles. However, having no leading axles meant that the whole locomotive could under no circumstances be heavier than 120 tons, as 20 tons was the max axle load, but that could be achieved. However, despite the overall concept being the first of that kind, there is still something that marks this locomotive as very dated by today's standards, and that is a crocodile-like divided superstructure. Both for safety reasons as well as for easier balancing out of the weight, it was deemed to put some of the equipment in front of the cabs, leading to the bonnets on both sides. While that means there's overall less weight that has to be supported by the middle section, connecting both bogies, it also means that, unlike with a modern locomotive, all the push and pull forces go through the bogies, which therefore are connected with each other and have to be of a very heavy and sturdy construction. But nonetheless, this design was more than anyone could have hoped for. Not only did they fulfill the requirements in terms of pulling power and speed, which led to a much greater capacity of the Geislinger Steige as train speeds increased and the number of trains requiring a banker decreased. They also were surprisingly smooth runners, with a surprisingly low wear on the track. You have to keep in mind, each bogie has 3 axles and the middle axle has no sideways movement whatsoever. It still managed to get through curves just fine, without overly increasing the wear as it was originally feared that they might do. And ultimately, between 1933 and 39, 18 of them, the class E93, were built, the original German crocodile. But that wasn't yet good enough. The war preparations resulted into a dramatic increase in goods traffic, with the inclines in the south of Germany being pretty much a bottleneck. And with the annexation of Austria in 1938, that situation became only more dire. So already while the last ones of the E93 had yet to be completed, this proven concept was further developed. The main demand was to raise the top speed to 90 km per hour, as that was pretty much the speed the Reichsbahn aimed for their fast goods trains. And you know, when some of the latest steam locomotives for goods trains, like the classes 41 and 45, could reach 90 km per hour, then really the electric one had to do the same. And that would also allow the new class to be used for passenger trains. But in terms of power, that does mean about a 30% increase is needed, which resulted into quite a challenge because the new locomotive couldn't really be any heavier than the old one, which was just 1 ton shy of the absolute maximum weight it could have. And you know, 30% more power doesn't just mean more powerful motors, and the increase in size really shows that. But through careful design, the engineers somehow managed it to still keep the new locomotive at just 120 tons, just about a ton heavier than its predecessor. However, the larger locomotive meant that the wheelbase was longer, and while the E93 was still going happily around curves, the E94 was not so lucky and resulted into a lot of wear. While early on attempts were made to rectify that issue only after the war, that problem could successfully be resolved with a reliable wheel flange lubrication system. Multiple ones were tried out until one of them finally did the job. And as such, this new locomotive became part of the second standardization scheme for electric locomotives when its production began in 1940. But the ever-worsening situation of the war left also its mark on these locomotives. While their production continued as important locomotives for the war effort, they also had to be simplified. While it's not as obvious as with the steam locomotives, after all there wasn't really that much that could be simplified, and it wouldn't have been that cost-effective after all, as their number was always planned to be comparatively small, an attempt was made to replace all the metals that had to be imported with metals the Germans had themselves. In particular, copper cables were replaced by aluminum rails, which wasn't always possible as the rails required a lot more space than the cables and also weren't flexible. So there were situations where both copper and aluminum had to be used behind each other, which led to a whole range of other problems, as you can imagine. But still, until the end of the war, 145 of them were built, which in terms of German locomotive classes is still a fairly small number, but back then a big one for electric locomotives. But with the end of the war came also the end of electric operation, at least for a short while. As heavy goods locomotives, they were in high demand, and as soon as electric operation continued, they were back on the rails again. And they were in fact in such a high demand that more of them followed. There were of course some locomotives whose construction had started during the war but wasn't completed. They were completed now, 3 of them in Austria and 9 in Western Germany. And to bridge the gap until new developments were ready, which should become in Western Germany the E50, it was decided to build even more of them. So the Bundesbahn received 43 further locomotives that were entirely new builds, bringing up the total number to 200 E94s. And the Bundesbahn went even a step beyond. Some of the new builds had new and even better motors, which brought up the locomotive's power by about 40%, which also allowed the top speed to be raised to 100 km per hour. With that, the so-called class E94.2 had already very similar stats to the later E50, and as such the German crocodiles proved their worth for many more decades yet to come. It wasn't until 1988 the Bundesbahn withdrew the last of them. In East Germany they were employed until 91, where they were, by the way, lovingly referred to as Eisenschwein, literally iron pig. And in Austria even until 1995. However, the Austrian ones were also majorly refurbished. And with private operators, they stuck around even longer. The small company Rail for You comes to mind, and only when it closed down in 2018. Also the chapter of the German crocodiles in revenue earning service came to a close. And we talked about this particular color scheme in a different video, by the way. A healthy number of both classes is preserved and can still be seen live in the wild today. The German crocodiles might be a lot smaller than their Swiss and Austrian counterparts. And I'm not talking about the E94s built for Austria, I'm talking about the actual Austrian crocodile, the Tatzelwurm. But the E93 and E94 still hold their own in being probably the most modern crocodile locomotives there ever were. And, at least for Germany, also the very last is, despite being a major leap forward in electric traction. Pretty soon their design and overall concept became just as outdated as that of their predecessors. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you had a good time. If you did, there's much more where that one came from. And I also owe a big thank you to the channel supporters who make sure I can continue to create awesome stuff. See you on the next one!